As I approached Josh's house, my heart was beating faster than usual. I hadn't been here in a long time, even though this place had always felt almost like home to me. Josh and I had grown up together. Even though he was older, I always felt that there was a special bond between us, stronger than any friendship. But the years had passed and something in that bond had faded. Realizing that we hadn't seen each other in so long, I decided to pay him a visit. I wanted to tell myself that it was just a friendly visit, but something told me it was more than mere politeness. When Josh opened the door, I barely recognized him. He looked different, thinner, his face tired, his eyes dim. It was strange to see him like this. He had always been a model of calm confidence and strength to me. We went inside, and I noticed that everything inside seemed empty, as if the house had become a reflection of his soul. Almost nothing extra, like he hadn't really lived here. There was only one chair in the kitchen, and I had to find a second one. A pause hung in the air. I looked at the familiar walls, now devoid of warmth, trying to find the right words. "How are you?" I asked, breaking the silence. Usually, such a simple question felt almost inappropriate this time, but I knew that if I didn't start the conversation now, it might never happen. Josh didn't answer right away. He stared into the emptiness as if considering whether to open up. Finally, he spoke. I don't know. Sometimes it feels like I'm stuck in some strange dream that I can't wake up from." He fell silent, then added almost in a whisper, "I'm lonely, you know? And it seems like I don't even know what to do with this feeling." I froze, stunned by his confession. He, the very Josh who had always been the rock for all of us, now seemed lost, like a stranger to himself. It was painful to see, and I had no words. I simply took his hand, just like I had done many years ago when we were children. We sat in the kitchen, and I didn't let go of his hand, trying to offer him at least a little warmth. It seemed that the silence was bringing us closer than any words could. Josh stared at our intertwined fingers for a long time, as though this gesture was something unfamiliar to him, and in that moment, I realized how hard this was for him. "I don't know when it started," he finally said quietly. "It's like one day I woke up, and everything around me felt foreign. Work, people, friends. I feel like I'm trapped in some endless routine with no way out, and no matter how hard I try to get back to the person I used to be, it doesn't work. I don't know who I am anymore." His words pierced me. Josh had always seemed unshakable to me, like a rock I could lean on when I couldn't manage on my own. He was the person I could always turn to for advice and support. And now he was sitting in front of me, exposed in his vulnerability, and I wanted to do something to ease his pain. "Why didn't you say anything before?" I asked. The question slipped out before I realized how it might sound, but I really didn't understand. Why was he alone when he had loved ones, when he had me? Josh gave a short, bitter smile. "How could I say that? Everyone was used to seeing me as confident, strong. You too. How could I admit that I'm struggling? It would have sounded stupid and pathetic." I shook my head. "Josh, I would never have been indifferent. Never. You've always been there for me, supported me. Now it's my turn." For a moment, it seemed like he didn't believe me, but then I noticed a slight change in his eyes. The heaviness eased a little, as if my presence had become a lifeline for him. Josh looked at me with gratitude, and I understood that maybe our connection hadn't just returned, it had become stronger. I suggested that we see each other more often. It was a spontaneous decision, but I knew he needed support, and I needed the chance to be there for him. Josh slowly nodded, and I felt that he wanted this too, but couldn't say it out loud. That simple step seemed almost impossible to him. The next day, I went to Josh's house again. It seemed like a simple gesture, just returning, but there was something important about it, as if I were confirming my words with actions, and he understood that. We had agreed to go through his old things, although, to be honest, it was more my initiative. I wanted to pull him out of his stupor, to help him see something more than the usual mess around him. We opened an old, dusty wardrobe where Josh kept his childhood and teenage memories. Inside were boxes full of seemingly useless things: old cassette tapes, notebooks with scribbles, badges and medals from soccer competitions, and, of course, photo albums. I grabbed the first album I found, opened it, and immediately came across a photo of us. Josh and I, laughing in some forest, our faces striped with sunlight, smeared with dirt and happiness. I handed him the picture, and he glanced at it before quietly smiling. "Remember that hike? We ran away from the adults, sure we could find our way back on our own." He shook his head, reminiscing. "And in the end, they searched for us for 2 hours. I thought they were going to kill us for it." I smiled, remembering a time when everything felt so simple. Josh had always been my protector, even when he found himself in trouble. "But we did find the most beautiful meadow," I pointed out. "You said it was like our secret place." He nodded, smiling a little warmer than before. We continued going through the things, and the more we found, the more memories surfaced. Summer vacations when we set up a tent by the river, winter sledding trips, sleepless nights spent talking about who we wanted to be when we grew up. It turned out that in these things, a whole life had been hidden, one in which we were always together. These memories slowly broke down his inner wall. At one point, he looked at me the way he used to, with warmth and trust. It felt as though the chasm that had separated us all these years had finally disappeared. We were laughing again, like children, losing track of time, and for the first time in a long while, Josh looked alive. As I was leaving that evening, we shared a brief but tight hug. He was grateful, and I knew it. In his eyes, there was no longer that sadness that had weighed him down. And although we still had many long conversations ahead, I felt that we were rediscovering the connection that had always been between us. Another week passed, and Josh and I began seeing each other more and more often. I would come over in the evenings, sometimes with a prepared dinner, sometimes just to sit and talk. The sense of closeness between us grew stronger, as if the threads that once connected us were now tightening again, turning into something more powerful than before. One evening, while we were sitting on the couch, chatting about some silly childhood memories, Josh suddenly fell silent and looked at me with unusual seriousness. His gaze was long and intense, as though he was trying to say something but wasn't sure how to. I felt a tightness in my chest, not understanding what was happening, but sensing that something important was unfolding between us at that moment. "You've always been there," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "Even when I thought there was no one around, I felt like you were somewhere out there." My heart started pounding faster, and I couldn't look away. Those words stirred something inside me, a forgotten, suppressed feeling that suddenly broke through to the surface. I felt his hand on mine, and it was so unexpectedly close, almost painfully so. A silence hung between us, heavy and dense, like the air before a storm. He slowly tightened his grip on my hand, and I felt the warmth radiating from his fingers. Josh was looking into my eyes, his face so close that I could feel his breath brushing against my skin. In that moment, I realized that all these years, we had tried to hide not only the past, but also what had always remained between us. He leaned in, and before I had time to process anything, his lips gently touched mine. It was a light, barely perceptible kiss, but it ignited a flame inside me that I couldn't ignore. I froze, stunned. I hadn't expected it, and I didn't know what to say. But despite my embarrassment, I didn't pull away, and in that there was a silent response, perhaps the one he had been waiting for. When he pulled back, we both remained silent, still holding hands, not daring to break this fragile moment. He looked embarrassed, as if he couldn't believe he had taken that step. I felt something inside me shift as well, though I couldn't quite understand it. Everything seemed unreal and unsettling, but at the same time, it felt so natural, as if we were simply continuing a conversation that had started long ago. After that evening, something changed between us. We both knew it, even though we didn't speak it out loud. When I came to Josh's house again, it was quiet and a little uncomfortable. We were both being cautious, as if afraid to make a careless move that would destroy the fragile world we were building. At some point, in an attempt to lighten the mood, Josh suggested we cook dinner together. We started picking a recipe, debating, laughing, and gradually the tension dissolved, giving way to the familiar warmth. We cooked like we did when we were kids, setting up our restaurant and trying to impress with dishes made from whatever ingredients we had, though in reality, we spent more time laughing and playing around than actually cooking. It felt like time had reversed, and we were once again the children we had been. While cooking, he accidentally splashed water on me, and I, laughing, decided to pay him back in kind. We turned it into a full-on water duel, just like we did as kids, laughing so hard it felt like we had forgotten everything else in the world. Soaked, disheveled, and happy, we sat on the kitchen floor, wiping our faces and laughing, not paying attention to the puddles around us. In moments like these, I felt like I was finding something I had long lost. Josh looked at me, and in his gaze there was gratitude, warmth, and something else, something beyond words. We continued cooking, quieter now, but there was no more tension between us. Josh came up behind me, hugged me around the shoulders, and looked over my shoulder, casually pressing closer than usual. When dinner was ready, we sat down at the table, making toasts, laughing. Everything as usual. But the sense of closeness, of what we had shared together, filled every moment, making my heart race. That evening left an impression. In the quiet glances, in the accidental touches, in the simple happiness of being together. After dinner, Josh suggested I stay and watch a movie. We settled on the couch, and I noticed how his hand lightly touched mine. We sat, wrapped in a single blanket, and I felt cozy, but in that coziness there was something more. Not just comfort, but deep closeness. I knew that an invisible barrier had appeared between us, one that we both felt but tried to ignore. By the end of the movie, I felt his head rest on my shoulder, and we sat there, almost motionless, until the screen went dark. It was a moment of silence and understanding, without words, without unnecessary actions. Just the two of us, in quiet peace. Again, there was that same subtle moment, but this time we both knew we wouldn't talk about it. We simply accepted it, as something inevitable, something that had already become part of us. A few days later, in the evening, Josh suggested we go for a walk. The city was wrapped in silence, with only a few pedestrians hurrying along their way, and the streetlights softly illuminating the sidewalks. We walked side by side without any particular destination, letting our steps guide us forward. This walk felt special, without rush, without unnecessary words, just the two of us, almost blending into the city around us. "Everything feels so different now," Josh said quietly, looking ahead. "I used to be so sure of myself, of my plans, of knowing what I wanted. And now—" He fell silent, as if searching for the right words. "Now I don't know how things are supposed to be. Everything has changed." I heard not only doubt in his words, but also a hint of something more. This different world, this new perspective. It included me. I, too, felt that the life we once knew had faded, as if someone had turned a key in an invisible door, opening a new reality where there were only the two of us. "Josh," I said softly, trying to find the right words so as not to shatter the moment. "What do you want now?" Without looking back at what was before. He stopped and looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully understand. "I want to feel like I'm not alone, that there's someone next to me who understands, that there's meaning, that there's a future that doesn't scare me." He sighed, looking up at the stars above us. "When I'm with you, it feels real." "You know, Josh," I said quietly, "I feel the same way. With you, I feel like home, like everything else is just noise." We continued walking silently, each of us reflecting on our feelings. At some point, I realized that I was holding his hand, just like we did as children, but now it was something more. We simply stayed quiet, looking at the night city, thinking about how we could be more than just close to each other, but something truly important, something that went beyond the usual words and relationships. One evening, when I was at Josh's again, we were sitting in the kitchen, just like we had gotten used to over the past few weeks. We were chatting, drinking tea, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. In that moment, it felt like we had become ourselves again, the people we had always been for each other, but now with some new, deeper understanding. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I jumped. Visitors rarely came to Josh's, and we weren't expecting anyone. Josh frowned, got up, and went to open it, while I stayed in the kitchen, feeling a strange unease wash over me. A few seconds later, I heard a familiar voice, and my heart stopped. It was Paul, my husband. I went out into the hallway and saw him standing at the doorstep, looking at me and then at Josh, confused. He clearly hadn't expected to find me here. His face mixed surprise with something else, something I couldn't quite define. Paul glanced at us both, and I felt the tension in the air become palpable. "What are you doing here?" he asked, trying to speak calmly, but his voice was tense. I tried to explain that I was just supporting Josh, that he was going through a tough time. But that wasn't enough for Paul. He stared at us for a long time, and finally broke the silence. "You've been seeing each other too often. I get it. Josh is your brother, but this doesn't look like just support. Is there something more between you two?" His question hit me like a shot, and I felt everything inside me tighten. The words caught in my throat, and I couldn't answer immediately. Josh stepped forward, as if preparing to say something, but I stopped him with a gesture. I knew this conversation needed to happen between me and Paul. He looked at me, with pain and disappointment in his eyes, and I realized I couldn't simply deny my feelings for Josh. That would be unfair to both him and myself. "Paul, I don't even understand how this happened," I began, feeling the lump in my throat growing. "But it's true, there's something between me and Josh. It's hard to explain." I spoke with difficulty, not lifting my eyes from the floor, while Paul stood frozen, as if not believing what he was hearing. He was silent for a long time, then quietly but firmly said, "You have to choose." His voice was almost a whisper, but in those words, I could hear the full weight of his pain. He didn't shout, didn't accuse, but his calmness felt even more devastating. I understood that he was leaving now, leaving me with the decision, the choice that would determine our future. Paul turned and left, leaving Josh and me standing in the deafening silence. Josh looked at me, and in his gaze was understanding and regret. We both realized that our connection was unique, but now we were faced with the hardest truth. We would have to sacrifice something important. In that moment, I understood that the feelings between Josh and me would stay with us forever. But perhaps we would have to leave them in the past. Several days after that evening, I couldn't think about anything except what had happened. Paul hadn't come home that night, and I couldn't bring myself to pick up the phone and call him, even though everything inside me screamed that I should. I understood that something had happened between Josh and me, something that couldn't simply be ignored now, but I also knew that my responsibilities to my family, to Paul, were stronger than what had occurred between Josh and me. Josh and I met the next day, but the conversation between us was heavy, silent. We sat in a cafe, leaning on the tables, and I felt how inevitable this conversation was. The silence between us, thick and painful, wouldn't allow us to hide the truth that we both knew well but didn't want to admit. "I don't want you to feel like I'm abandoning you," I finally said, trying to find the right words. "But I can't continue like this. My husband—" I stopped, unsure of how to go on, but Josh interrupted me, his voice soft but determined. "You don't need to explain anything. I understand." He said it in a way that made me feel how difficult this was for him. "You need to be with him. It's the right thing to do." His words seemed to tear away the last remnants of my certainty. I was ready to keep seeing Josh, to support him, but I understood that in this relationship we had gone too far, and at some point, I would have to choose. and I chose. I chose my family, even though my heart was breaking from the thought of leaving Josh behind. We sat silently, looking at each other, and in that moment, I realized how much every moment spent with him had meant to me, and how much I would miss that feeling. But we both understood that the best path now was to turn everything back, even if it would be painful. You were a part of my life, Josh. You'll always be a part of it. But we can't be who we were, I said, trying not to cry. He nodded, and although his eyes were full of longing, I saw gratitude in them. We understood each other like never before, but our paths were now diverging. The goodbye was brief. We hugged, but there was nothing more in that embrace than regret and acceptance. I left, and he stayed there, where just a minute ago we had been together. We both knew that this connection would remain in our hearts as a warm memory, a part of our past, but no longer a part of our future. I returned home, but something inside me had already changed. I felt myself next to Paul again, but now our relationship was different too. We both remained silent, and perhaps that silence was what we needed to start anew, taking into account the changes that had happened in our lives.